I guess I should just explain that these stools are, every part of this stool, well, no, I shouldn't sign. I should shut up. Sorry, okay. Tim designed these, so there's a separate jig for every part of this stool. It's an exquisite work of craftsmanship. And so everything that seems random is actually, I could never have done it myself. If it had been me, I think it would have just been the bucket upside down, which I don't know why he didn't do that. All right, one last PSA. The gallery owner requests that you all finish your beers. He does not like having half-empty beers, and the Canadians amongst us can appreciate that. The more you drink the beer, the more you enjoy the show, and the more likely there'll be more beer at future events. This is actually, now that you mentioned, this is the beginning of animated film occurred with exactly this setup. Does somebody have an actual beer I can demonstrate? A man named Stuart Blackton, we'll talk about in a much later performance, created a character who saw a drawn beer, and then the performer, a lightning sketch artist, took the beer, drank it, and then he became sort of upset, and then he pours the beer in and he becomes inebriated. And this was actually the beginning of animated film. And that man started Vitagraph Films, which at one point was the biggest grossing film company in the world, and they were based in Midwood, Brooklyn. Hey, whiskey. As you can tell, I have a little trouble with figuring out where to begin this talk. We've been planning this for a long time, and every time we thought we had a sort of point of origin, it kind of spread into a dozen different possibilities. And I kept backing things up further and further, trying to figure out how to sort of draw this back into a kind of a coherent narrative. Turned out to be impossible. But you see the model is sort of cell division, I think. Really, I think the furthest, I mean, every day that the show, every day that I thought about the show, it sort of backed up further and further, and luckily we sort of ran out of time. The last notion I had about how to begin this idea of these stories that sort of interweave and overlap was with the old Cabinet of Curiosities, which sort of flourished at the dawn of the age of discovery. At least that's what the Europeans called it when they went off into the world. And you would have things like narwhals and mermaids, fake mermaids, sort of side by side. This was a mermaid that's in the Peabody Museum at Harvard. It was originally designed, it was originally owned by Barnum, of course. It was supposedly came from Fiji. It was not the kind of mermaid that we think of now, but it was basically a monkey welded to a fish. And but the difference between a fake mermaid and a real narwhal was not significant. The basic idea was that both were just designed to sort of boggle your mind, and being boggled was basically the point of display. It was only later that museums came in and began to distinguish what was real and what wasn't real. So what we're left with now is a kind of a hodgepodge. If you read the New York Times, you listen to your friends exchanging emails, you get a kind of a sense of how we try to sort of touch the infinite by contemplating things which are beyond our sort of conscious or rational understanding. When I was reading, you know, when I get my half-baked ideas in the newspaper, and there's a thought piece about the sort of counterintuitive nature of subatomic particle behavior. And the experiments have been going on for 100 years now, where you would like shoot particles, subatomic particles, through a screen that has 2 slits in it, you would expect that if they're behaving like proper particles, they would sort of cluster in 2 sort of parallel lines that mimic the sieve, so to speak, that they're going through. But instead of acting like particles, they act like waves, and they create a kind of an even distribution. Except, if you tag each of the particles as they go into this, then they suddenly behave like particles, as though they heard what you were saying about them, and they behave like particles. But then, if you take the little tag off, as soon as they go through the sieve, they go back to acting like waves. So they're like trying to anticipate what we're doing. So we're not sure if the joke's on us, the joke's on them. But as Bishop Berkeley, the idealist, said 400 years ago, to be is to be perceived. What we think we see is perhaps controlling what we're seeing or what's there. And I think it's the same thing with stories. And just to throw in for Joe and Chris's edification, the same is true, I guess, of that stupid cat, Schrodinger's cat, which is either alive or alive and dead, depending on the unpredictable nature of the decaying particles in the box with it. So it's given rise to many bad T-shirts over the years. Let me check here. I think this problem of trying to tell a story that may or may not have a consequence is not just a human desire. We always look to the animal kingdom for sort of verification of our idiosyncrasies. And I was particularly taken by the story of the bees, how the bees communicate to each other the location of a flower. There's the famous bee dance. So here we are in the hive. Here's the sun. Let's say there's a flower over here. The bee does this waggle dance, and then around, and then a waggle dance, and then around. It was originally thought that this was some complicated piece of geometric engineering, that you take a right angle from the sun, and then the level of declension from the sun creates an angle that tells the other bees how to fly to the flower, no matter where they are. That any bee could reach any bee anywhere and do the waggle dance, and the flowers would be. But actually, it's much simpler, and it seems to make sense. It's just dead reckoning. The bee dances towards the fucking flower over there. You see the flower? So, we try to make things more complicated than they have to be. Actually, the bee does not go back. The bee performs this careful figure 8. The bee is actually a more complex thinker than I am under stress. But more interesting than these kind of encounters are the sort of chance encounters, I think, where other kinds of stories emerge. On Wednesday, I think it was the first day that things had warmed up, and I was walking our dogs, Flurry and Jeffrey. And there was a man, the snow was just beginning to melt, and there was a man shoveling a pile of snow that was in front of his car, even though there was no real purpose for doing it. And so I stopped and said the kind of inane thing you say, like, that snow's never going away, is it? And he said, no. And then he bends down and he points. There's a small ding under his right front fender. And he said, the snow did that to the car. And I said, the cars are all plastic. And he said, yeah. And we sort of bonded over that, and then it went away. And I know exactly what he was doing. He was trying to sort of mitigate the damage to his car, which clearly bothered him, by telling the story of the damage of the car to somebody else and sort of somehow defraying the costs. So I've done the same thing. 1 day later, Thursday, I was walking the dogs again, and I passed a man on our street who was loading junk into his van in this empty lot by our house. And I said hello, and he said, life is hard. And I said, yeah, I didn't know. It was 7 in the morning. I had 2 dogs, and this garbage guy says life is hard, and I could agree. But I felt like he was too trying to share something perhaps more metaphysical than the Dent man. But in the end, the point was to sort of offload this idea and sort of share some sense, both of the concrete and the ineffable, which I appreciated. I'm going through a lot of drawings. I hope we have enough. All right. It used to be a little bit easier to have some faith that we could comprehend these sort of cosmic problems that both the car men were dealing with in the last 24 hours. Incidentally, nothing interesting happened on today's dog walk, so 2 out of 3 isn't too bad. There was a man named Anselm who was the Archbishop of Canterbury and later a saint, and now a steakhouse on Havermeyer and he's mostly famous for his what's now called, thanks to Hegel, I think, the ontological proof of God, which is this. Can we not all agree that we can conceive of a power of which there is no greater thing as a proposition? And he says, yes, anybody can agree to that as an idea. And he says, aha, since you have thought of that idea, then that power, which is, of course, God, must exist. Otherwise, the thought would be invalid. Because if the thought is invalid, it's not a thought at all, but we've just agreed it's a thought. So he was very pleased. It got him a sainthood in a steakhouse. But immediately, there were some refutations of this. The most interesting one was another priest who was probably had more of a sense of humor than St. Anselm, which said, all right, I can conceive of an island of which there is no greater island. So let's go find that island. And you can't. So therefore, there is no God. I don't know what happened to that priest, but the real point is, I suppose, that the very fact that he thought he could conceive of God or death or anything of that ephemeral, sort of unnatural level of sophistication was sort of a beginning mistake in his logical reasoning. But as I say, it was sufficient for the time when everybody agreed there was a God. Now things are more complicated. And I was actually, this is when I was an undergraduate in studying anthropology in college, I was much more comfortable, as most of us are, with this notion of this God, whoever they may be, being a kind of remote figure. But it was very interesting to read about a tribe, now I'm sure extinct, who had in their own cosmology a tree that was the origin of the world. Not unlike our tree, or the Judeo-Christian tree in the Garden of Eden. This tree gave birth to everything that there was in the world. The only thing that was different about this tree than sort of a more familiar tree is that that tree actually was in the middle of the courtyard of the village that had this religion. So they actually lived with the origin of the universe, sort of a variation on Mormonism. But I think the thing that bothered me about, the thing that amazed me is that you could have a sort of a coherent theological system that involved a living mortal thing. And I don't know quite what would have happened to these people after the tree went away, whether they had to rethink everything or whether they were conveniently wiped out by everybody who followed the anthropologist into the village and they never had to find out the consequence of their logic. But I do admire the way that these people like Anselm and others and contemporary fundamentalists can sort of make sense of the world in a way that I cannot, Tim cannot, maybe Tim can. Tim's a clever guy. This in particular is interesting to me, and it sort of goes to the basic sort of the conflict between the man with the dent, I think, and the man who observed that life was hard, which is it's a lot harder for most of us to think abstractly than concretely, which is why it's so comforting to realize that the world is 6,014 years old. And you can actually prove that if you work backwards. There's very helpful websites where it shows you how you can reconstruct the age of the world, because it's sort of like you backdate. Okay, you begin with Adam, and it very clearly says that Adam, well, I guess Adam begat Seth. And forget Cain and Abel. Seth was important because he was the one who began having children when he was like 106. And then Seth begat Enosh when he was like 108. These guys all lived to be 1,000 years old, and they all had their children when they were about 100. And so there was like 10 generations of these guys, one after another after another. You get to Methuselah, and then you get to Noah. Noah, who was 600 years old at the time of the flood, and then 600.1 years old 40 years later when he was on the mountain. And then after the sort of age of the patriarchs, you have the age of the kings and the age of exile, the age of slavery. Pretty soon you're in recorded history. You can see, and there's basically 6,000 years laid end to end, and you have the history of the world. And that's why one of those guys, one of Anselm's buddies, could actually date the origin of the world to like Thursday afternoon, March 23rd, 4014 BC. We can do that too in a much more prosaic way. And that is, if you think of this country, which we tend to not think of as a kind of a coherent entity, but we've been around for about 240 years or so, and it seems that most of that history is lost in the mists of time and sort of myth. But this is one of those little facts that always cause me to rethink my relationship to the universe, and maybe it will help you. There was a man named John Tyler, who was born in 1790, which is early in the administration of George Washington, I believe, the first president of the United States. John Tyler was a member of the South Carolina gentry, and he eventually was the first accidental president of the United States. He was the vice presidential candidate with William Henry Harrison, one of the long line of unqualified generals who became president of the United States because they won small wars against foreign countries or Native Americans. And he was famous for winning the Battle of Tippecanoe, a river in Indiana, I think. So the slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too is like one of the first memorable political slogans. Unfortunately for Harrison, he was 68 at the time of his inauguration, and to prove his virility, he stood out in the rain for an hour giving a speech and died of the flu a month later, elevating Tyler to the presidency, which he was entirely unfit to occupy. And he spent 4 years trying to protect the interests of the South, his South Carolina heritage coming into play, before running unsuccessfully for re-election and retiring to his home in South Carolina, which he named Sherwood Forest, because he'd been exiled from the Whig Party and he considered himself an outlaw. Besides his undistinguished political career, which then we'll get to a little bit later with the final few unflattering details, he had a rare ability to procreate. He had 8 children by his first wife, who dropped dead of exhaustion in about 1860. And then he had another wife and 8 more kids, stretching on into the last years of his life. One of his, not his youngest, but one of his younger children was born in about 1860 and went on to have his own sort of distinguished career as an academic. He was the president of William and Mary College, which he rescued from financial bankruptcy or something like that. But he had children when he was 62, to a number of sons. So there actually exist 2 men alive today, one of whom is living in Sherwood Forest and giving tours, who are the grandsons of a man who was born in 1790, was president of the United States 25 years before Lincoln was killed. that the history of our country, laid end to end, can be spanned by the 3 generations of these reactionary politicians from the South, I somehow find quite moving. But I clearly am alone in that feeling. This is the danger of sweating. What the hell was I going to say? I have backup. Drum solos. It wasn't that. It wasn't. It wasn't. You know, if you do any more of that, I'm going to do a thing I know you hate, which is to do the whole. You don't do that.
Anytime you forget, just say
drum. It turns out what I forgot wasn't important, which is why I forgot it. But
it's subliminal editing.
No, I'm going to say it anyway, because now I looked at it and I hate to waste my research. Well, I was actually going to say that John Tyler, at the end of his life, became a senator for the Confederate States of America from South Carolina. So he's the only ex-president, as far as we know, who ever held a seat in the foreign government, although he, luckily for him, dropped dead before the actual beginning of the war, which spared him some indignity. But keeping with this theme of sort of how these lives sort of jump far from the sort of distant past into a future that sort of embodies an event in a way that we can't imagine, there were people who were born and fought in the war who were alive during the lifetimes of many of the ancient people in this room. That all this, there were a number of veterans of the war who lived into the 1950s, even into the late 1950s, or maybe they just claimed that they were, but they. So I think one of the last men who died in the 50s had actually shaken hands with Lincoln in the White House, which is kind of an interesting idea, or at least he claimed he did, which is almost as interesting as if he did or did not. But also, if we go back about 20 or 30 years, before these men, you had to be 100 or more to be alive. In the 1930s, there were a number of veterans of the war living in nursing homes. And at least in the state of Arkansas, they were considered extremely desirable marriage material, because they all had what were considered, I guess, generous support from the state of Arkansas for their wonderful defense of the Confederacy. And so lots of young women were marrying these guys with the assumption that they would die before them and that they would have this annuity to live on for some time. This became such a problem that the state of Arkansas actually passed a law sometime in like 1930 saying that no woman born after 1890 could receive a pension from as a widow of a dead Confederate soldier. So I mean, it's kind of icky to think of what they were kind of thinking about, but if you were like 40 or above, it was okay, but the more nubile you were, the more they didn't want you, or maybe they were just doing their due diligence, and they realized they were on the hook for a long time for some of these people. In fact, the last Confederate War widow died 6 years ago. She got married when she was 18 to some guy in his 80s, and he died online, on schedule, and she hung around living off his $39 a month pension for a long time after that. So I don't know what's more amazing to think about, a man living in the 1950s who heard cannons at Gettysburg and shook Lincoln's hand, or a woman who lay in amorous embrace with a man who was firing those cannons, and I don't know. That was what I forgot. Now you know. This idea of forgetting is actually at the core of what we're talking about tonight. And there is a theory which is completely insane, which some of you may find interesting and even familiar, which is that we don't remember anything, that everything is about forgetting. And I think Chris remembers this, that memory is actually a kind of human construction based on sterile nuggets of events that we kind of construct a fiction around in order to shield ourselves from the unbearable knowledge of the inexorable passage of time and the loss of all that we hold dear. This is how the system works. There's the man Jeffrey Sonnabend came up with this idea, and overnight binge of creativity, which his notion was that there were these two sort of geometric forces which he almost saw as sort of organs, as individual and eccentric as a lung or a pancreas would be, that we all have this sort of cone of forgetfulness or obeisance, as he called it. There's a central axis called the Spelian axis, which is not named after Tim, but I don't know what it's named after. It's sort of basically our point of view. There's this, down here is the etmonic disk, and then every point where this plane, which I'll explain in a second, intersects with this cone of forgetfulness is called the Spelian disk. And then the interior of the cone is called the hollows. Okay, so this is the plane of experience. This is the obverse side of the plane. This is the perverse side of the plane. As we experience an event, at the moment of the experience, we're down here. You're in the moment. But as this shifts through from the obverse to the perverse side, you can see the circle of experience gets smaller and smaller until it disappears. And this is the decay of experience that we think of as memory, but it's actually the act of forgetting. And then once it's forgotten, the experience is over, but we're in this, we're in it, and then we sort of reconstruct the memories by adding details the way you would colorize a black and white picture. That's not really anything real, but a complete construction of our minds. If this seems like crazy bullshit to you, it's because it is, but it's such a beautiful drawing. I thought you would like to know that. All right. To return to the Civil War, or actually the embodiment of the Civil War as it stretches into our present, back to the 1930s, just about the time that all those aging Confederate soldiers were marrying all the young women of Arkansas, Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind, which was basically a not so veiled defense of the Old South, but it was a popular potboiler. And then when it became time to make it into a movie, we will get into some of these details, not to be a tease about this, but we have 7 more shows to do, and I don't want to go do all the work tonight, but a woman named Anne Rutherford, an actress, played the role of one of the sisters in Scarlett O'Hara's sisters in the movie, and as part of the promotion of the movie, she went around the South visiting the old soldiers' homes and posing with the soldiers and receiving all these beautiful corsages with the sort of battle flag of the South on that. And this was considered sort of a very quaint and attractive form of movie promotion. I mentioned Anne Rutherford for a couple of details. The part of the sister, I think it was Clara O'Hara. It can't be Clara O'Hara. I wish it was Clara O'Hara. Was actually supposed to go to another young actress who was actually up for the role of Scarlett herself. If this woman had gotten the role, I would like to think that none of us would be in this room, because if that woman had gotten the role of Scarlett O'Hara and become Vivian Leigh, her whole family would have been swept into the vortex of her melodramatic life. And the reason we wouldn't be here is that that woman's name was Margaret Talichet, who was my Jude Talichet's wife, Jude Talichet's husband. Let me start that again.
Nephew or cousin or something.
Jude Talichet, who is my wife, is the first cousin once removed of Margaret Talichet. And the fact that her cousin was a minor movie star, and we'll go into the details of her minor movie starness later, attracts me and interests me far more than it interests Jude. So when I think of the possibility that Jude would be like some Kardashian in LA if her cousin had only gotten this stupid role, and that I would not be here, and so you would not be here probably. You wouldn't be here, or at least this part of the story wouldn't be here. I find incredibly significant for no reason whatsoever. But that gets us to the problem of the movies in general and how they work in sort of reifying this theme of the sort of relationship between the present and the past, and whether the movies could possibly be anything more than simply a sort of passing record of a time. To me, that image of Margaret Talichet in black and white in these various movies is like a living ghost of some kind of the person that I know. And I find that very moving. Maybe that's not right. But there was a book written in 1940 by Boris Casares, called The Invention of Moral, where this idea takes root in a kind of much more concrete form. Basically, he was an Argentinian, a friend of Borges. In fact, Borges' sister Nora drew the book cover for this book called The Invention of Moral, which sort of owes some allegiance to the island of Dr. Moreau. But it's about a man, an unnamed fugitive, who sets sail. He's given the directions to this island somewhere in Polynesia, which is actually where the fake mermaid, the Fiji mermaid, came from, if you're trying to draw this all together. He arrives on this island. It's got rocks on one side. It has a series of buildings. He's exploring this island. He's trying to get away for some unknown reason. And he's told that nobody goes to this island because there's radioactivity there and everybody's scared of it. But the second day or something, he suddenly sees there's a bunch of tourists have shown up and they're having a wild party. And he watches them. He watches them for several days. And he begins to fall in love, particularly with this woman named Faustine, who, according to all the literature on this book, was modeled after Louise Brooks, the movie star who had recently retired and broken the heart of the writer who felt that she should go on making movies forever. But she was sick of the movie business. In any case, the fugitive is like following her around, he sees that there's a man named Morrill who seems to have some expectation of her affections, and he becomes very jealous because he falls in love with Faustine, and he eventually actually approaches her, but she ignores him. In fact, they all ignore him. And then he notices that they're sort of doing the same thing over and over again. They're acting inappropriately. If it's warm, they're acting cold. If it's cold, they're acting warm. He begins to think he's losing his mind until he discovers the secret. While he's eating, they go away for a while, and they come back. He notices that there's 2 suns in the sky, 2 moons in the sky, that they're dead fish and then living fish alternating in the aquarium. And what it turns out is that Morrill, the mad genius of the story, has created a machine. We're never quite sure if it's analogous to a filmmaking machine or just one of these early science fiction inventions where you don't go into any details, you just get straight to the chase. But this machine is capable of recording every sensation, every vibration that the human beings give off. And in essence, since the soul is in the detail, he has created a way of these people living this one perfect week over and over and over again. He doesn't tell them this when he invites them there, and when they find out what's going on, they're not very happy because they realize they're all about to die of this strange radioactivity that comes from being exposed to the machine. But it's too late, and he's kind of upset that they're not grateful that they're now being given immortality, because he's actually built his machine to sort of operate on the tides coming in. So it's very green, and they can keep living this week over and over again for eternity. The fugitive eventually begins to accept his fate when he inserts himself into the movie in such a way that he can appear to fall in love with Faustine, and she can appear to fall in love with him. But of course, she can't see him, and he leaves a letter to, I think, an unknown reader saying, if you could ever invent a machine that would allow a Faustine to see me and love me, then I would be eternally grateful. So there's that possibility. On an open source site for neurological studies, I came across a paper that was inspired specifically by the invention of moral. And the idea is, according to this scientist, that modern advances in virtual reality and brain mapping technology will soon make it possible for us to replicate the experience of the island. The science of the island of moral is not commensurate with the ideas that inspired this writer. That we could actually create a way to sort of re-embody experience endlessly if we just had enough data. And his idea is that we need the sort of third-party observer and the first-party experiencer, which sort of is what Bishop Berkeley was saying 400 years ago. To be is to be perceived, and what the stupid particles are doing and the cat is doing, I guess. He doesn't know quite how to do this, but he says the best model is the dreams. In dreams, we are both experiencing reality as though it is, as though it's real, even though it's not real. That somehow we can connect ourselves to the activity in our brains when we dream. Then perhaps we could live forever. So that's it for tonight. Thank you.